I'd like to start with my slides and show them exclusively as I go through them. What I'm about to say is my own personal viewpoint, does not relate in any way to the federal government. Nothing I'm stating is reflecting government policy, and they're my original thoughts as a private citizen. Next slide. This is a presentation of what I'm familiar with, and the beginning of my journey was back in...
A little closer, if you could,
Sure.
So we could hear you better. Thank you.
My journey began in 1980 with the book called Sunburst: Return of the Ancients by Norman Paulsen. And the book was fascinating in the fact that there were a lot of very anomalous UFO details shown. This particular side-by-side photo, and the person who took the photo was a deputy sheriff holding the Instamatic photo taken in broad daylight over Giant Rock. This is fascinating because none of this has happened since then, and Van Tassel, George Van Tassel, was responsible for holding UFO conferences through the 50s and through the 60s. I even talked to Dr. Bob Beck, who witnessed one of these craft, and as you can see, there's some type of force illumination below the craft as well. So I went out to the community and found what they were working on was a homopolar generator. Next slide. The interesting part of the book described the propulsion system as being 12 magnets around the outer edge of a very large disk, size of the ship, carrying off electrical current. 2 disks in opposite direction provided the gravity force, whatever propulsion system they had. So this particular passage I reprinted in my Homopolar Handbook. Next slide. And also convinced my professor at the State University of New York at Buffalo to let me work on it as a physics project for my master's degree in physics. And I was very pleased to actually build a homopolar generator, test it for back torque, and unfortunately I measured back torque, which means it slows down as you draw current from it. So the mystery continued. Next slide. I basically found that Dr. Ed Mitchell, as you see here on the cover of Extraordinary Science magazine, was also interested in the same topic. Bruce De Palma was the source of the interest, and he was building homopolar generators like crazy, looking for investors one after another, which he succeeded in doing. However, Ed held on to his money, which is in his breast pocket there. And what was interesting about this particular cover that came out years later was that the Searle disk is also shown on the same magazine cover next to the homopolar. So I thought this was sort of a coincidence or synchronicity, and I ended up investigating the Searle disk. Next slide. And I met John Searle in 1980 in Germany, and he actually became kind of a curiosity to me. Even today, he still is. He's still a living legend. He claimed to have these disks, as you can see here, hovering, and he had a UFO experience when he was young, and then he started building these things. So, next slide. Basically tried to help him, connected with different people. He essentially became a little more well-known when he gave a talk in Berlin in 1990, and then some Russians discovered him because of that lecture in the video and decided to build what they described as a single roller magnet assembly with 12 roller magnets around the outer edge of a ring. And so I started to think twice, hey, this may be something related to what was called the Mu disk back in the Paulsen book. And that's one of the biographies you can get off the shelf, Antigravity, The Dream Made Reality by John Thomas. Next slide. So the long story short is that these roller magnets are individual homopolar generators, and they definitely seem to lend itself to voltage generation if the whole ring could somehow be propelled. And that's the magic and the mystery behind the whole thing. Well, the Russians had a whole grocery list, as you can see on the right, of all these anomalies that they supposedly measured. And so what I ended up doing, next slide, was to connect them to an investor, which I constantly do throughout these years, find an investor for the strange inventors, put them together. In this case, we went to the Department of Energy. The contact was very friendly to us, offered a Russian translator for us. We did due diligence for the whole day, and the investor was comfortable to throw his money at the Russian Godin Rosten inventions. And the outcome was, next slide, the big prototype that cost a lot of money, which was built and completed in Moscow. And then it was retrofitted and completed again and again, and even to this day, it doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do, but it certainly looks interesting. Next slide. So back to the George Van Tassel story, since this is dealing with implications of extraterrestrial technology, George's story is that he had lots of UFO experiences, even rides on craft and so forth. And his, would you say his download or his conclusion from all of these experiences was, hey, I'm going to build a healing chamber, a rejuvenation chamber, called the Integratron. And it's right near Giant Rock. I've actually gone out there. Next slide. And it still is in existence today, Integratron.com. And it's all wood construction with no nails. Next slide. And it's very fascinating because it has these unusual die rods. The whole assembly of die rods was supposed to rotate. And it also has a primary and secondary coil inside that looks like an inverted Tesla coil. So you get the impression that it would draw atmospheric electricity. Since it's very dry there, it's feasible this would work, and then charge up the inside with some of this energy. Next slide. So that concludes the possible rejuvenation implications of ET contact. And what I'd like to conclude with is the zero-point energy, inertial shielding, and electrogravitics. Next slide. First of all, zero-point energy is very famous. I wrote a book on it. I wrote 2 books, actually. And it's been confirmed consistently, even up to last week, where our Future Energy News announced some new polymer pyrrole that actually can't be explained unless 2/3 of it is due to zero-point energy. Next slide. And here we have the reason why zero-point energy may be important. And we'll see if she can insert the 30-second video that's supposed to actually start. I'm not sure if we're going to get a video or not. But, oh, maybe. Okay. Yes. Okay, this is an example of many. You've probably seen some of these already. The craft is spinning. It's up close. It looks like a legitimate, authentic video, amateur video. And right about now, you're going to see a very fast acceleration. And that's what we've been talking about, folks. Let's go back to the slides. The G-forces on that would be incredible. Let's go back to our slideshow if we can. And the important part is that this introduces a concept which I'd like to share with the panel, and that is inertia is involved. And as we get to the next slide, hopefully we can see that. The inertial mass and gravitational mass are totally different. I repeat myself. Inertial mass and gravitational mass have nothing to do with each other. Einstein made a mistake years ago and called it the equivalence principle. I studied it even in grad school. I took relativity and I took general relativity. And so it's fascinating to me that it's sort of overlooked. Slide right after this. And the important part is that nowadays, inertia has been discovered to be a zero-point field Lorentz force by Hayes, Wetter, and Puthoff. This is a seminal paper that's so important that it opens the door to actually controlling inertia and understanding how any ET craft or UFOs could possibly have fast acceleration, right-angle turns, and maybe even travel through the universe. It turns out F equals V cross B, a simple Lorentz force at the bottom of the slide there showing how it works. So when we go around a curve and you feel that force moving you in the opposite direction, it's an electromagnetic interaction. Next slide. And this applies to relativity. I heard one of the gentlemen on the panel questioning special relativity. Well, that's inertial mass. That is the m in relativistic increase in mass as you go toward the speed of light. If you can shield inertial mass, miracles happen. And this is another demonstration. I showed this slide to the Deputy Director of the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, in case you don't know what NRO stands for. And this was very important because, as you see, F equals ma, Newton's law, can be modified. If m can be shielded and it lowers, then a could increase for the same amount of force. Next slide. Oh, and by the way, the NRO Deputy Director said, well, things like this tend to become more and more classified until they're out of sight. He says it's easier for us to reinvent it for a private contractor. And I said, you mean the taxpayers have to pay double for something like this? And he said, yes. So here's another proof of inertial shielding, and that is the right angle turn. That's photographed here with open shutter, 35 millimeter on tripod, 2 a.m. outside Stewart Air Force Base. The triangle craft started from the upper part, and the shutter was open, made a tremendous right turn, then continued as if nothing happened. Red and green lights make it look like it's conventional. Next slide.
And Dr. Valone, you've got about 1 minute.
I understand. I see. And now the conclusion is electrokinetic equation helps explain how we can combine electrokinetics or electrogravitics and inertial shielding. Pulsed current will produce a force. Next slide. And I wrote a book on the electrogravitics effect that's even present in the B-2 bomber, thanks to Paula Violette's work and research, and originally starting with Townsend Brown's research. Next slide. And the conclusion is, and I have to give thanks to Mark McCandlish, who gave a testimony at Dr. Greer's 2001 disclosure project in D.C., since we know once in a while such electrokinetic powered craft are put on display, as this one was in 1988 in Norton Air Force Base, which is also his entire testimony is reproduced thanks to Mark in my book Electrovitics 2. And this is also verified and investigated by Dr. Hal Puthoff, and I talked to him personally about this story of Norton Air Force Base showing 3 hovercraft, and he did his due diligence with it, and he says he put it in his gray box of possible events. Thank you.
Thank you very much.